The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome everybody to the webinar of Patrick MacManaway, and I'm here. My name's Kelly McCosker from RCS, and I bring Patrick MacManaway as well from Vermont. It's 9 p.m. there, and you're joining the webinar, An Hour of Power with Dr. Patrick MacManaway. Patrick, welcome.
Kelly, thank you so much for organising this today. Delighted to be connecting to, I'm sure, some familiar friends and current clients in the audience, as well as some new folks today as well.
Wonderful. And just before we get started too much, I'll just do a quick sound check. For those who are logged in, we have over 80 people joining us today, which is wonderful. Can you send through a quick message to me and on the chat for those who are familiar with the software, and I can just make sure that you can hear me. And Patrick.
Should I be speaking to get a sound check happening here? Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our afternoon. I'm 16 hours behind you at -9 degrees centigrade. So I'm the opposite end of everything at the moment.
Excellent. I have one confirmation that they can hear us, Patrick, so I think we're good to go. Yes, fantastic. So I'll hand over to you. Thank you very much. And at the end of today's presentation, I'll help with any questions. So if you have any urgent questions, feel free to, or you'd rather ask them right away to our audience, feel free to send them through as a message or a question, and I'll help manage those and pass them on to Patrick. But certainly at the end, we will allow time for questions and answers before we finish at 1 o'clock Queensland time. Thank you very much. I'll hand over to you, Patrick.
All right, Kelly, thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues, clients, people tuning in for the first time, RCS has, I think, very courageously embraced the realm of subtle energies or quantum physics as a significant element in the agricultural environment and landscape. And I'm privileged to be working with them and both working with clients and training practitioners who will be further available to, sorry, we have Eastern Standard Time chiming behind us, able to provide services in my absence throughout the Australian farming community. So this evening really serves as an introduction for people who are looking at this for the first time, and a review of the core principles and some familiar stories that are both inspiring and supportive in terms of this work and what might be possible on your own farm at home, simply for the practice of increasing your awareness and engaging in this kind of process at home. So my plan is to work through a set of slides which are long enough to last a lifetime, and we'll get as far as we get for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions and answers and to elaborate on any key points that people listening are interested in. So in a moment I'm going to disappear myself and start a slideshow. Give me just 2 minutes pause while I manage to do that. That one. No. Kelly, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Yes, I can hear you, Patrick. So just changing over with the show my screen. Just we need to get to yours still.
Are you seeing my slideshow now?
Not as yet.
Not as yet. Are you seeing my slideshow now?
I can see you now, not your slideshow yet. Have you paused anything there, or? Won't be a moment, folks. We had this working 5 minutes ago, so as a test.
Yes, we started. Yeah, we did a dry run yesterday even.
Even yesterday, all working smoothly.
Help me, Kelly. What are you seeing now?
So I can see you, your video, but not your screen. So under the screen sharing tab, show my screen, can you use the drop down box and choose the option there? That's it. Okay, I can see your screen now, Patrick, and you're gone as planned.
Perfect. Thank you. Here we go. Thank you for your patience. Here we are. All right. So just as in terms of introduction and also in terms of review, there's a huge amount of philosophy and theory and fascinating practice and technique when we look at subtle energies and their application in agriculture. But at heart and core, we're talking about the effects in the landscape of human attention and human intention. And what we find, both looking in traditional philosophies of sustainable agricultural practices in cultures that have done that for 6,000 years, as well as in quantum physics and the holistic community, is that there's a significant power and influence simply of human attention, giving our unconditionally loving awareness to something actually increases its life force in a mysterious way, but one that's repeatable and applicable over wide and large acreage. And then human intention, which is much more specific and focused in terms of harvesting a particular crop from a particular field in a particular year, or working with particular animals on a landscape. That gives us another layer of influence in what we find is actually an intelligent system that we're working with. We can let go of the thought of landscape as being inanimate and of the plants and animals that we're working with as simply being amoebic. We're actually working with a highly evolved, intelligent ecosystem that has its own sets of parameters, and when we understand those, then we can interface with them using this application of human attention and intention to support our farming practice, increase fertility, increase yields, and sustain ourselves during the various many stresses that come up season by season. So just a quick word here before we get into detail on the trainings available this year. We have an introductory level coming up in March for people who are interested in getting into an understanding and practice of this on their own farms. And then we have an event in October, Walking in the Quantum World. This is really a sort of immersion into the thinking and thought processes and applications in various parts of our lives of quantum mechanics and subtle energies, and will include a fire walk, which is always a great fun thing to do. And if you come, you don't actually have to walk, so that's fine. And then, as you can see the dates here, there are consulting opportunities for me being present in Australia this year, and from April we'll also have associate practitioners available through RCS who have trained with me in the field and are ready to supply services through RCS in this regard, whether I'm around or not. So we're expanding our team here so that these things can be available to you at all times. So philosophically, we go to college now to study agricultural science, but traditionally we think of farming as husbandry, and of it being extremely personal, of it being intimate, of it having a quality of emotion, and being a very personal relationship between really the spirit of the place and the spirit of the farm and the spirit of the plants and animals and the spirit of the human family and farming community related to this. And we might think of this as being folkloric or traditional or whimsical, but what we see when we look into this is that the more we separate ourselves from our landscape with rubber tires, with expansions of scale, possibly the less intimate we become actually with the intelligences of the plants and the soil that really we're working with in our endeavor of farming. And so in a shamanic sense, we're really looking for communication and dialogue with anything that's intelligent in our landscape. And what we find, and what I'll show you some interesting data on as the slideshow progresses, is that both soil organisms and the collective of the soil bio layer, as it were, and also the plants themselves and also the animals themselves, they have both individual and collective intelligence, and they are able to organize themselves in different ways depending on the circumstances of their environment. And that's really what we can influence in these ways. So when we approach the landscape, we start by looking at anything that's stressed or wounded in the landscape, and look to heal that. The wounding in the landscape of mining, of indigenous displacement, of possible events, recent or past, involving succession or division of landscape in various ways. So we start by looking into the layer of trauma, resolving that, and then bringing the landscape into the current dialogue of who we are and what we're doing and what plants and animals we're using, and make sure that the soil and the spirit of the land really recognizes the plants and animals that we're working with in a way that it can direct its own life energies into supporting their fragility and thriving versus the myriad other plants and animals that it'll have in its library of residence. And then finally, there are optimizations that we can do, fine-tuning towards particular ends and endeavors, depending on the circumstance of your own operations. So just to start with one or two examples, so that we can lift ourselves out of the mythical category of fantasy and into the mythical category of really directing our life force in a very constructive and positive way. This, as you can see, is an extraordinary result from a farm in New South Wales in 2011, and the farm was carrying an Aboriginal massacre residue, which was creating a very particular atmosphere on the farm relating to the events surrounding that. And when I visited, that was the main piece of work to do, was resolving the stresses around that and rebalancing the energies, the living energies of the farm, restoring the spirit of place to its natural state of health, and really making sure that it understood at its own level of intelligence, the elemental and devic layers, what was being endeavored by the human community in relation to it now. And as you can see, the result was a 44.5% higher than best ever yield in the crop planted subsequently, and also so many beneficial insects, spiders and wasps in the crop that this farm alone of 10 served by the local area agronomist did not have to spray for Heliothis. So in terms of healing, a landscape. That's a beautiful example. This is a very particular and interesting example also. This is in England, in the county of Gloucestershire, an ancient farm, the Woeful Dane Organic Dairy Farm, possibly not good feng shui in their name. But I've worked with these folk for about 5 years, and we trade in cheese. They're national award-winning cheese makers, and after I started working with them, they won the Best Farmer in Gloucestershire Award 2 years running. But what I wanted to particularly focus on, just in terms of presenting this evening, the bloating from the alfalfa, the lucerne crop. They had two parallel fields, both planted to lucerne on the same day with the same equipment and the same seeds, and the cattle grazed one off in good shape. And when they moved to the second, which was their final green forage before going on to dry feed for the winter, they immediately started to bloat, and so clearly the crop had become indigestible to the herd. And so they called me to see if I could fix this up. And as I'm sure many of you know, plants have two separate metabolic systems, interwoven but distinct. The system of primary metabolites, which are the metabolites that are constructed for the plant to grow and thrive in its own right, and then a huge range of secondary metabolites, which are created by the plant very quickly in response to stress from predators, pests, fungi, and anything else that might damage the plant. And apparently what had happened was this lucerne crop had expressed secondary metabolites to create the bloating situation. So following the protocol that we work with and teach in the level 1 and level 2 trainings, I sat down and meditated with the field and brought to mind the spirit of the place and the spirit of the field and the spirit of the plants and the animals and the soil organisms, and effectively had a roundtable conversation in my imagination, which is where some of this work most effectively can occur if clearly focused and well directed. And we had a roundtable conversation until everybody agreed that everything was good. And then 12 hours later, when the animals were let back into the same field, they were indeed able to graze the whole field without any further digestive problem or bloating occurring. So in terms of the possibility of what we can do with our attention and intention on our farms, and cultivating the awareness of the consciousness of plants and animals, it appears that we can literally negotiate with the intelligence of plants to render them more digestible to the animals that we're grazing than they might otherwise be if they're not in the same conversation. There's quite a large menu of techniques that we use in the subtle energy realms. This is a nice example of one where we are effectively putting up an antenna to capture the Schumann resonances, which are the resonances of sunlight at different frequencies that, when penetrated into the soil, stimulate plant root growth particularly, and plant health and vitality generally. And we're seeing this location in New South Wales. This is a so-called biodynamic tower with crushed rock on the inside and then a layer of PVC piping and clay beyond. Originally put up to support its biodynamic garden here with beneficial subtle energies penetrating into the soil, but when doused, was shown to have a radius of influence of about 450 yards, which happened to include and not include 50% of plants placed in an adjoining paddock for shade for cattle. And so these are the trees that arrived and were planted outside of the zone of influence of the tower that we just saw. And these are the trees that were planted inside of the zone of influence, quite coincidentally, but obviously with very dramatic consequence. So we can see that the possible benefits of working with the subtle energies of our mind, with the subtle energies of the environment around us and of the earth itself, can actually be quite extraordinary in certain circumstances, and often very beneficial in many circumstances. A tower similar to the one that we just saw had this yield increase and increasing quality to premium hard from second and third grade. And so, as you can see, we're starting to harness natural energies, the resonances of sunlight and the natural intelligence of the soil and the farm to really focus and bring a maximum level of coherence into our activities and the support that the landscape can give us for them. Wait, I'm sorry. I'm having a slide freeze moment here. I apologize. Sorry, I've momentarily lost control of my slides. Let me come back to where we were. Here are the subtle energies that we use. Human love is at the top of the list, which sounds a little bit soft, but actually unconditional applied attention seems to come out at the top of every list in terms of increasing life force, either in our children or our communities or our plants or our animals. And more often than not, simply by giving unconditional love to sprouts on the kitchen table or the tomatoes in the greenhouse, or indeed the wheat over 100 acres, we often find the most amount of benefit, 20 to 30% yield increases, sometimes increases in frost and pest resistance, increases in germination rates, simply from human love. And so it's a rather simple message, but it does seem to be true that actually the application of unconditional love, which is what we would call a blessing in truth, seems to be the most powerful thing that we can do with our mind. Undoubtedly, there are many things then with more specific intention that we can apply in terms of identifying the crop of choice in a particular field in a particular year, or making sure that the landscape's absolutely got the barcode of our cattle or our sheep or our chooks or whatever we're working with. But those two things stand above everything else in terms of the effects that we see, either that a practitioner like myself can bring to your farm, or that you can do for yourself simply today and now, or through the programs that we offer. And then you see there's a list. Sound we mentioned with crocodiles, geomagnetism and Schumann resonances are what we're seeing with those tree increases. Biodynamic preparations, classical homeopathy, radionics. There's quite a range of effectively free technologies, all of which can increase not only health but also resilience in our farming process, and which are easy and fun to learn, and frankly a joy to practice. Now, this is something called a toroid, which is the shape of everything as a basic magnetic field. For anything to exist in a single point in time space, you have to look like this. So actually we look like this. We're standing in that little bit in the middle, and then our wings, our aura, or our electromagnetic field expands around us. You can see your halo there at the top. But it turns out that everything that has existence has to have this same basic field shape, and so the human system is the same as the atom, is the same as the wheat, is the same as the cow, of the planet, of the solar system, of the galaxy. So we're all operating on a single system. This is our basic physics. We can see the field is generated by a polar magnetic variation, and then this creates a stable field that holds planets and also holds people. Our heart is responsible for generating our own supportive field, and is also responsible for the walnut and the apple. Here is man as apple, woman as apple. So just to say that then we're living immersed in a field of electromagnetism. Our own personal bubble generated from the heart, the Earth's personal bubble generated from its center and its magnetic fields, and then that interacts in a very dynamic way with everything around us. So here we see the solar wind is beating like the hands on the skin of a drum, creating resonances in the electromagnetic spectrum within the space around us, within our atmosphere. Now, the loudest of these natural resonances turns out to be the midpoint of our own brain waves, 7.83 cycles per second, 7.83 waves per second, the so-called Schumann resonance. And it turns out there's no difference between sunlight and thoughts, except that our thoughts have slower, longer waves than sunlight, but they're waves that move at the same speed. They're just ocean rollers rather than choppy little pond waves. And so literally our thoughts are electromagnetic waves that, similarly to the waves generated by sunlight, wrap themselves around the Earth and have similar influence both through their frequency and their waveform telepathically, effectively, as sunlight does. Now, there's a lot of research and study into this. The beta, alpha, theta, and delta waves are the 4 octaves that our brains basically run over, and you can see the higher frequencies, 14 to 30 waves per second, is our awake and normal consciousness. The alpha, which is the next octave down, 9 to 13, 13 to 9, relaxed, calm, lucid. Below that, 8 cycles down to 4, deep relaxation and meditation, mental imagery, and then deep dreamless sleep and autonomic function in the delta zone. Now, research has shown, and this is tremendously significant for our understanding of the effects that our minds can have when applied towards our landscape, is that plants have delta frequency, theta frequency, and also alpha frequency. In fact, trees will come up to 20 to 24 cycles per second in terms of their background measurable waveform, which is already into our low beta consciousness, which is our alert, self-reflective consciousness. But primarily we find plants in the alpha and theta ranges when we measure the vibrations. So when we compare the consciousness, literally the waveform and frequencies the plants are using to think and express themselves, what we find is that they're inside of our own experience, and so they're not in fact having a different experience or a different intelligence than ours. They're actually having experiences within our own consciousness waveform. So if we think of ourselves as having a full spectrum of light, then maybe plants have red, orange, yellow, and blue, but not the green and indigo and violet. So literally we overlap their consciousness, particularly in our more relaxed and calm and meditative mindset. So this is tremendously significant in terms of working cooperatively and creatively with the plants in our landscape, either as crops or as grazing forage. and the wave becomes a circle in a dynamical form. So we can think of ourselves holding this image that our thoughts and feelings are actually radiating out, literally, like sunlight, all of the time, whether we like it or not. We actually can't stop this happening. The only thing we can do is ride the horse and ensure as much as we reasonably can that the communications, the telepathic communications that can be read and are being read by the plants and animals as well as the people, and even down to the soil structure, that these waves are being read, because this is an interspecies universal in terms of the waveform and the frequency. So our thoughts and minds are being heard by the landscape around us and the plants and animals in us. And so by engaging in that, as in the way that you do in every other way in your farm, but really engaging with the intelligence landscape, we can start to create an opportunity for cooperation and co-creation, and small and large miracles unexpected as one goes along. As I've been saying, consciousness is a function of frequency, just in the same way that the different tones of the guitar or violin come depending on the frequency and the length of the chord. And this is a very ancient concept. This is a medieval diagram of the levels of consciousness, just like a guitar. And you can see the hand of God tuning the divine monochord at the top of the violin neck there, and the elemental realms at the bottom, and then the human realms, the angelic, and so on. So we have a sense of different intelligences holding their own different frequency and wavelength, and simply by attuning ourselves to those that we're working with, then we can have creative dialogue with whoever we're working with. And in the level 1 and 2 programs, we explore this in greater depth in terms of which parts of ourselves we use to connect with different parts of the landscape. Here, though, we're looking at the waveform that we generate from our heart and from our mind just by thinking these thoughts that ripple out in the landscape, whether we like it or not. So we see that the wave of joy is quite distinct from that of anger and hate and love. But we can't stop these rippling out into our farm, into our fields, into the minds of our animals, and they respond depending on which of these they feel coming from us. These, I think, are some of the most useful images that we have in terms of the power of our thoughts, both attention and intention. And I think many people listening in and looking in tonight, this afternoon, sorry, will be familiar with these. But those of you who aren't, I think this is some of the most dramatic research that's been done in a generation. Dr. Masaru Emoto of Japan has found a way of photographing water as it re-emerges from a crystalline form and reveals the pattern of the crystalline matrix that it's holding. And so the photo on the left, as we see, is of an ice crystal frozen from severely polluted water. The photo on the right is the same water refrozen after having been blessed. Now, here's so the blessing is an offering of unconditional love, and you can see how it's changed the level of coherence and the patterning of this water. And we would then immediately think, well, which would we rather drink ourselves, and which would we rather irrigate our crops with, and which would we rather give to our stock, and how much difference would that make? And the answer is try it at home, because this is easy and immediately applicable, and water obviously is at the heart of all of our agricultural practices. We can see Notice bottom left here the harmonious sounds of the Tibetan gongs and bowls increase the life force in our crocodile eggs. We can see that heavy metal music apparently is discordant and incoherent to life processes. And there's actually quite a lot of research on both plant and animal effects of the difference between playing Mozart and jazz and heavy metal and so on. And if you look back in folk tradition in Scotland, if you did not know that singing to your cow increased the milk yield, then people would think you were a little bit odd and off the wall. So we know this both from contemporary research as well as from folklore. And blessing water is definitely something we can do on the farm. It's something that indigenous communities do as a regular thing. Even in the UK, we would do this on an annual basis. We can do it on farms in Australia, and on one farm in New South Wales, when we blessed a borehole that fed half of the 120 paddocks on the farm. Immediately having done this, we discovered that the sheep were galloping and let out of a dam field that had not been blessed into a pond, into a trough field with blessed water. She galloped up to 1.2 k straight to the trough, and 6 months later we blessed all the ponds, all the dams, and immediately the sheep reverted to an indifference and no longer ran to the trough water because the dam water was blessed already and so enhanced for them. So one of the RCS passes of the level 2 process is to assess how fast you can get sheep to move towards water, and Kelly can give you the test parameters for that when it's due time. Just one more thing relating to water and the result actually from this year in New South Wales also. Water responds to our intention in frankly mysterious and sometimes miraculous ways. And we're looking at a dry creek bed here that had been dry for 8 years. And there were certain levels of stress on the farm, elemental stress, human residuals, other aspects that we worked in terms of healing the property, and then working with it to establish the sense of farm, the sense of community with the animals and plants, and bring this all the way down into the elemental consciousness realm. Feedback within 2 weeks of our working was that without a rain event, this dry creek bed that we're looking at now had filled up with water. Clients reported not only that the creek bed had filled with water, but that this had happened only on their property. So I can't guarantee that we can do this at home for you, but I think it's just a sense of amazing and possibly extraordinary things are possible when we really engage with the subtle energy realm and with the concepts and applications of quantum physics, not as abstract, but as real applications that can bring very specific and direct benefits to us on our farms and in our farming economy. Now, Kelly, I'm seeing it's 9:38. I should stop talking probably at this point and field questions here.
Thank you, Patrick. That was really interesting. I love the examples across the world. And thank you, everyone, for your messages at the start. And there's some lovely welcomes and hellos. So now we've got 20 minutes that we can help with any questions and answers. So if you do have a question, please feel free to send that through to me. I can pass that on to Patrick, and we can benefit from his time a little bit further. So just waiting on any coming through. While we're waiting there, and if you're giving that some thought, I just wanted to mention that, as Patrick did point out, we have a level 1 workshop in March. That's going to be at Yarrandoo Eco Lodge outside of Armidale near Earball, and there's still places there. And also there's going to be an all-level workshop in October, which everyone's welcome to, whether you've done training with Patrick or not, and they will be able to grow your skills. So I have a question coming up, Patrick. Oh, they're flying through now. David has asked, what is the typical size of the area of intent you can work on from towers?
Very good question. With towers, I think one's really programming them with one's own mind, and some aspects of the reach of a tower probably is limited by the shape of the landscape in terms of hill and valley profile. When one looks at the energetics of a landscape, sometimes there are energetic areas that are somewhat distinct and that may or may not overlap, that need to be related to separately. So it rather depends on the farm, often that's part of the fun, is discovering how your landscape works and is networked in that way, and which places are the easiest points to access communication and interface and leverage on your own farm.
Thanks, Patrick. And Jane's asked, she has a question about permission, particularly in relation to Aboriginal energies. Do you need some more information on that question, or are you able to give a bit more about that?
You have more information on it?
I'll just, Jane, if you're there, I'll unmute you, and then maybe you could just pop through quickly. I'll just find you. Okay, Jane, you're unmuted now.
Yeah, it was just about how do you go about asking for that permission, essentially.
Yes.
Thanks, Jane.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. That's really one of the most golden questions, because working with landscape trauma, it really needs our absolute compassion. And what we find when we look around the world is that the Bronze Age people displaced the Neolithic people, and the Iron Age people displaced the Bronze Age people, and then the Romans displaced the Iron Age people, and then the Saxons displaced them, and then the Normans displaced them, and so it goes on. And so there's something in the human psyche that creates ethnocide and genocide and landscape displacement, some deep-seated fear of finding sufficient resource for us. So the circumstance of the Aboriginal colonial interface in Australia is in truth only one particular of a generic across the whole planet. And possibly the worst of all was where I came from and grew up in Scotland, where due to an agricultural revolution and our king inheriting England and never coming back, we actually cleared ourselves off. We did it to ourselves. We burned the houses of our indigenous people and dropped our population by about 75%, and sent them all off to America and some, of course, to Australia. So there's a very generic situation that we're looking at, which is how do we heal a displacement pattern of a culture displacing the culture previous. And there are practices of soul retrieval and of blessing and healing the residual emotions and intentions of a landscape, of allowing earthbound spirits associated to go free and return to their ancestral families and move back into the soul stream of reincarnational life, should they choose to, allowing the elemental consciousness of a landscape to release itself from the fear and trauma and stress and overwhelm of events relating, and then to repattern the landscape afterwards from one that has supported a hunter-gatherer community to one that's supporting an agricultural community, which is a very different ask from a landscape. So, but just in terms of working with the Aboriginal spirits, infinite respect, infinite compassion, and soul retrieval, spirit release, and blessing and healing for everything that's occurred really is the best we can do, I think.
Thank you, Patrick. From Sarah, who I believe the photos came from with the spring that you had. Sarah's joined us. If this can be answered easily, she said, how do you work on increasing the immunity of herds? For example, pink eye in a herd.
Yes, many levels, and I think to go as far as one needs to. The first thing, as with that protocol, to look and see whether there's any background stress that's creating a problem for the herd in the landscape. And hopefully, Sarah, we've got that sorted, but you never know, we can always look more. Then to look anything else that might be stressing the herd in terms of anything they're carrying, if they're cattle that have recently come onto the property, stress or trauma from events previous that you don't know about, anything problematical in terms of the stress, the season, and the diet. Then particularly to strengthen the collective spirit, the team spirit, as it were, of the herd, of the mob. We know our sporting teams, almost regardless of who's playing, sometimes they got on a winning streak and they just go and run because the spirit of the team is so strong. And sometimes, even if they got great players, they just can't get their games because the spirit has gone out of it. And so the same is true with our cattle, and by making sure that they're as free as we can heal them from stresses accumulated from wherever they come from, if they're new onto the farm, of transportation, cattle yards, make sure that they're really welcomed energetically, telepathically to the place as their home, and into the existing community of cattle already there, so they feel part of family. So anything like that we can do to increase their background strength and health. And then in terms of particular illnesses or stresses that show up in a particular season, we can look at that in a subtle energetic way generically, but often I think homeopathy and other very focused and directed subtle energy techniques such as those can really work well. Homeopathy is very well tried and trusted in veterinary medicine. Obviously it's non-toxic, so there's no downside, and it's, as we would say in the UK, cheap as chips. So specific applications, I think, possibly for specific issues, and certainly with something showing up like red eye, I check for background stress and then probably go to a homeopathic remedy, assuming that it's something very specific in the animal or the landscape in that season.
Thank you, Patrick. And Lachlan in Queensland's asked, if I have a brown dirty dam that is full of water but never really becomes clean, could the work with water blessing help this situation?
I would absolutely try and find out what's possible at home. Sometimes, honestly, blessing water is, as I shared with the story of the sheep, quite miraculous. And sometimes it doesn't seem quite to work. And so you've got to try it and see. Slightly depends, I think, on why the water is that way. I think sometimes it's just that's the water that's there. But water is surprising. And in Vermont in the drought, when I was first working in this field, by singing to dried up springs, they came back to life, 3 of them. And that slightly changed my thinking about how the world works and what's possible, particularly with water. And so I do think anything's possible. I've heard stories of water totally covered by algae cleaning up overnight after a blessing, of springs restoring themselves, of wells increasing up to double their productive volume. We just had a result on that. I don't have the numbers to hand, but almost doubling the volume in a well that we blessed in New South Wales just 3 months ago. So I would bless away and please let us know what happens, because we all need to support each other by sharing stories of success using these things at home.
Thank you. And I have a question from Rebecca. She's asking about sitting amongst the herd and meditating each day, and would you say that that would be beneficial to supporting the herd's health and well-being?
Again, whatever we give for attention, just simple loving presence, is tremendously supportive. And in one herd, a potty calf who was waved at and shouted at and smiled at and loved up turned out to have had twice the weight gain of his brothers and sisters when it came to weighing them out. And similarly, in your tomato plants, just by giving loving attention, you can get a 30% yield increase. So that's huge. How you do it, I think, is completely your own style. Whether you think loving thoughts about them while you're in the shower, or while you're meditating, or while you're with them, or literally spending time with them, I think to find that's very individual how we do this. There's sort of no right way to do any of this. There are principles and philosophies and applications and techniques, but because it's really a process of our own minds, ultimately we have to find our own way, and our own way is the best way for us, and the way that we'll get our own best results. So I think often, frankly, whatever appeals to the imagination and whatever comes to us as inspiration or instinct is often our best strategy. And you can do it when nobody's looking.
That's true. And a question from Jane. She asks, how do you ask for protection?
Protection is always one of the basic foundational processes that we cover in both level 1 and level 2 practices, and undoubtedly we'll cover that and review again in the all levels workshop. I think probably too short a time here to speak to that in any detail. I'd be happy to respond to that in email, Jane, if you have a particular concern about that. Basically, though, we need to have sufficient self-awareness and a few techniques up our sleeve in order to make sure that we can navigate in the world without becoming stressed or negatively influenced by the things that we work with. And working one-on-one as a holistic therapist, for example, one develops strategies not to get slimed by the things that one is deliberately freeing and releasing from one's clients. And working with landscape, the same is true, but the scale is much larger because landscape is so much bigger than us. And so it's very important to be able to work in a state of grace and with guidance and protection from angels and celestial beings of all manner, and to work that way. So that's definitely part of the art and craft, is walking amongst dragons without getting your toes trodden on. So very important. And something we certainly cover during the training programs.
Thank you, Patrick. I've got a good question here from Kate as well. She's asked, can other humans cause disruption to the work that's been completed? For example, if an employee or a tenant who doesn't share that same positive energy but spends more time on the property than those who do give out that loving, generous energy.
Yes. Again, golden question. There's an infinitely sliding scale, I think, of influence, and a positive attitude is a wonderful thing, and a negative attitude can kind of slow things down. The sort of balance of influence is variable. Certainly strong and repetitive negative thoughts, if fueled by significant emotion, can create what we might consider a curse, even to a greater or lesser degree, where the life force is compromised just through the strength of somebody's negative thoughts in regards to it. That can happen sometimes in indigenous displacement patterns, as we discussed. Also, it can happen in successional processes at any time, where people feel disenfranchised through an inheritance process and then have very negative and committedly resentful and strong emotions towards a place. So, case by case, property by property, varying influence, and having that awareness and taking responsibility for managing the quality and tone of the energy on the property, and also the quality and tone of the connective pathways of thought and feeling and commerce and social interface between different properties and families definitely can make a huge difference to the health or stress that a system finds itself under. A very good question.
Thanks, Patrick. We might have time for one more. This is a question from Diana. She's asked, what types of words would you say in a blessing? And what would be an example of what you would say? Yeah.
Yes. It comes from your own mind, and again, a blessing is unconditional, but it's actually the most useful thing of all. Because if we give unconditional love, whatever we're giving it to just feels received and supported and affirmed as it truly is for itself, without having to change the color of its hair or its size or its shape or the music that it sings. And so it seems to be the simplest thing, but it's really the most powerful thing. And so the kind of words that people associate with that are grace, unconditional love, universal love, simple love, benevolent regard. The Buddhist community has a whole every religion has this. Compassionate witness is another nice word for it, but simply to allow one's heart to connect with a sense of the heart of the other, whether it's plant, animal, person, or circumstance or landscape, and for simple love to be present in that witness, and for no reason other than that. And it's the simplest thing, and it actually seems to have the best results. So,
Great, thanks, Patrick. We have a comment, or just something to mention, from Jane, who has said, now let me go back to that question, sorry. Asking about resources and recommending, is there a list of resources, podcasts, books, websites to learn more if it's tricky to attend the workshop? And absolutely, RCS does have a lot of that together and between our websites, and so we're happy to send that on to you, Jane. If anyone else would like that sort of information, then just contact the office here and we can recommend books and websites and whatnot. There are a few more questions, but unfortunately we've run out of time, and I will pass those on to Patrick by email, so he will, if that's okay, Patrick, endeavour to respond.
Yes. Yeah. And more emails if people have further questions. Do send them in, and I'll do the best that I can to respond to anything that folk have.
Wonderful. And just in summing up, I wanted to to thank everyone again for attending and making time today. A special thank you to Patrick for joining us and making time in your busy schedule and over in Vermont with the time difference and everything. It's always a pleasure having you present and share your knowledge and experience. And as we're going on 7 or 8 years now, bringing you to Australia and having I believe, a relationship with you. So we really enjoy bringing that experience to Australia, and thank you. So I'll also just mention for anyone interested, there's registrations open for courses with Patrick. As Patrick mentioned, he's also doing consulting. So we have those dates available on our website, and we can send them out. And also Kim Kiss will be taking consulting clients from April onwards as well. So back to you, Patrick, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Kelly. Blessings.
And everyone, thanks again. And I'll wrap it up there, and we'll pop the recording on our links. So if you do want a copy, I'll look to have it automatically sent to you. But if you want to pass it on, or just let me know, and I'll make sure you've got a copy. Great. Thanks again, everyone. Bye now.
Take care. Goodbye.